Hello, boys and girls of credit union land, and welcome to episode 40 of the CUInsight Experience. My name is Randy Smith. I am one of the co-founders of CUInsight.com, and it is my job on the show to have conversations with the best and the brightest of the credit union community. I get to pick their brains and see if we can't find a few nuggets that we can all learn from. My guest on today's show is John Bratsakis. John is the president and CEO of the Maryland, D.C. Credit Union Association, and as you'll see, he's involved in a whole lot more. We'll link to his bio in the show notes. I'd recommend checking that out. This was a fun conversation to have. I knew John and I would have a blast. I've gotten to know John the past few years running around credit union land, and I'll tell you, this conversation didn't disappoint. We talked about leadership and lessons he's learned along the way from mentors in the credit union space, as well as his father and growing up playing sports as well. We touched on advocacy and influence and why giving back to charities like the Children's Miracle Network hospitals is so important to him. I had, like I said, a blast having this conversation with John. I found myself nodding my head, and we laughed a lot too. After we stopped recording, we just kept talking. But don't worry, there was no shortage of nuggets that we can all learn from while the record button was still on. So without further ado, I give you my conversation with John Bratsakis. Enjoy. John, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you here. I know from past conversations, you and I are going to have a blast today. So,
thanks, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I want to jump right into it. You're involved in the credit union system, and the way like that, I've gotten to know you is on the national level. So outside of Maryland and DC. Two questions. Why is it important for you to have that voice and be in the system nationally? And how does that benefit you being so involved in the movement, credit unions in your state as well?
Yeah. So thanks. So yeah, I guess I don't really think about it as national. I think about, kind of relationships and networking and being involved in different things. And I think a big way that does is, one, it's a great way to learn, I think, and learn from other people, learn from other organizations. You get exposure to so many different thought leaders, different ideas. And then bringing that back home is also helpful. So that also helps get our people to have, I think it brings to our credit unions the opportunity to have a voice, to have a seat at the table when there's things that come up. If there's people that are looking for somebody to, oh, hey, sit on this committee or sit on this group, it's an opportunity to do that. And I think that's been really helpful.
We were talking before we started recording. I mean, you being in the DC area, you're kind of, just by location, you're also involved. You were mentioning, you had an NCUA board member at a chapter meeting with the CFPB coming up. I would think that's a huge benefit also for your credit unions.
It is. It's also a challenge. The best part about it is we're local, right? So we've been able to develop great relationships with the NCUA, the CFPB, whether it's down in Annapolis or with the DC City Council, and all of that's been great. So one of the best examples is when the CFPB had a question. They were developing their website for HMDA, and they called us and said, hey, could you get us 20 compliance people by Friday? And this is on a Monday, which is great. So it's a nice opportunity to do that. I think one of the other challenges, though, is that we are right here in the middle of it, and so are our members. And it gets pretty deafening, I guess, depressing, exciting. You get the whole gamut of being right in the middle of it all. So there's a blessing, and then there's also not a curse, but a challenge, I think, of being right in the middle of it.
I can see that. One of the questions I had for you, being on the front line of, the issues that are affecting credit unions, are like, what are some of the struggles that you and your team are seeing that credit unions are facing today? And, as a system partner, a league president, like, what do you do to help?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One, I think it's a great time to be out there as a credit union too, though. I think there's some great opportunities for credit unions. And I think one of the challenges is, how do you take advantage of those opportunities, right? And really growing, and technology is probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, is that there are all these opportunities, all these systems that can help you do things, but how do you weed through all the noise? Right. So how do you weed through all the noise that's out there? And I think what we've tried to do is, again, get out there, work with our partners, whether it's CUNY Mutual Group or PSU or whoever that might be that's out there that's, really on the front line, CU Direct that has a lot of different innovative technology, and then bring that back to our members as just expose people, I think that's what we try to do. How do you expose or help expose your credit unions to that? They get exposure to it through conferences and that, but sometimes it's nice to have one-on-one FaceTime with, a small intimate group and really delve into those questions. And I think that's one of the challenges for credit unions is technology is the great equalizer, but effectively leveraging it seems to be the challenge.
What you just said there about technology being the great equalizer, I can tell you that coming into doing this podcast, that was like a belief that I had, is like, even for, say, the small credit unions. And I don't want to say I'm questioning, I guess, is a good way of putting it. And it was something that I brought up when Chuck, you mentioned PSCU, was on the show, and when Bob was on the show from CUNA Mutual, is, do you feel like technology can be that equalizer, maybe focus on the smaller credit union, or is it a struggle on the other side, just keeping up with it, right? Or both?
I think it's both. Right? Yeah. I think you can look at so many of these smaller companies that started from nothing, right? People are probably tired of me they'll hear me say something like SoFi, right? Like They start in somebody's living room and then they become $1 billion institution, very quickly. And that's also, right, focus on your strategy. But technology helps with that. And I think it's understanding, where do you place your bets or where do you place your strategic focus and go at it. That's, to me, I do think it is. But I do think the challenge is there's so much out there, and sometimes it can be so expensive. The one thing that, right, technology gets cheaper everywhere, it seems, except with your iPhone or with core processors, right? So that's the challenge.
That is true. I think the new iPhone is coming out, and they tried to make it sound like it's cheaper, but once you add everything up, right, it's not. So, but hey, anyways, when I was doing some research for this, and just from previous conversations with you, I know that you're involved in a lot, not only inside credit unions but outside. Is there a passion project you're working on, or something you'd like to share with the listeners? And to follow up on that, like, why is this important to you?
Well, I think one of the things when I came here, which has been really fascinating, was our involvement with CMN, right? So that's always been kind of throughout my career, whether I was, in a credit union or in this role. Credit Unions for Kids, Children's Miracle Network has always been a constant. And then came out here, and the Credit Union Cherry Blossom 10-mile run is really a focal point. And what was fascinating to me is it's the melding of both advocacy and philanthropy, in that we get to go to the Hill and talk about something other than, hey, kill this bill or don't tax us, or, right, all the important messages. But we get to go on the Hill and talk about credit unions giving back to their community. And it's a very tangible way to do that and show our legislators. I mean, we had over 700 staffers run in the race last year.
No kidding.
Close to 200 legislators were honorary co-chairs of the race, where, they put their name on the race. And again, it's a way that in a unique way that we've been able to tie and show as an example all the great things credit unions do and how they're giving back to the community. And also, in a way that the Hill sees it in a very real way and participates. I was going to say, it's a pretty cool thing. So yeah, I would say, Children's Miracle Network, the race, that's really a big piece of our focus often.
I was going to say, the idea that the race is right, like it's on the Hill, basically, right? Like,
it is on the Hill, yeah.
It's very visual as well. That's a cool part
But you got to get off by 10. If you're not off by 10, man, the police make sure that the races open up, so you're going to get run over by traffic if you're not.
I would be in trouble. Running is not my strong suit, as anybody who's probably seen me knows. So, speaking something that I was laughing about when I was putting together the questions, is I know you're a Bears fan. And it's football season. I am, born and raised a Detroit guy, a Lions fan, obviously. I think you're only the second Bears fan I've allowed on the show besides Pembroke. So how you feeling about your team this year? I was thinking about this because I know you are a big fan. like you're in DC, there's Redskins, fans, there's Ravens fans. Do they try to get you to wear the hat? Do they try to get you to throw on a jersey?
Oh, yeah. So the best story I have about that, when I interviewed for the position with the full board, I got the question, so Ravens or Redskins? And I said, I'm a Bear fan. And they said, you got to pick one. Yeah, at least you got to pick one. And I said, well, if I got to pick one, it would be the Ravens, since I played defense through college, and the Bears play defense, the Ravens play tough defense. And somebody said, well, hey, why not the Redskins? And I said, because you got Rex Grossman as your quarterback, and he lost the Super Bowl for me. And he looked at me and said, oh, okay, I guess I can give you that one. So I feel pretty good. The defense is great. We'll see if the quarterback turns out to be all that they hope he is. I'm not sold on that yet, but we'll see. It's beginning of the season, so it's exciting.
Absolutely. Every year, right? Going to the Super Bowl. And as a Lions fan, that just doesn't happen. So, hey,
just so you know, the Lions are on my screensaver. It happens to be Walter Payton vaulting over them.
That doesn't surprise me. I've talked to, whether it's like a mutual friend of ours, Greg, obviously a big Packers fan, and, or when I'm talking to Pembroke about the Bears, I'm like, with the Bears especially, it always seems like every Walter Payton highlight is against the Lions. Luckily, there were a few Barry Sanders ones that had the Bears in the background.
There's a lot of Barry Sanders highlights.
So, we got that. But getting back to credit unions, and I was really looking forward to asking you this question, because I feel like you're vocal out there when it comes to this. Is there a belief that credit unions currently hold that you think just fundamentally needs to change to stay relevant going forward?
I was thinking about that, and I don't know if there's something that has to fundamentally change. I do think, and I know this has been mentioned by others that you've had on here, the idea that members are just going to come to us because we're credit unions. I think that's the one fundamental thing. But I do think what we have to amplify is the relationship we have with our members. And I don't know if we've taken that for granted at times, I think, but relationships is what drives us and what drives consumers, right? They have relationships with whatever the brand is, or whatever, you could call it an app. It could be a technology partner, a gaming partner, and I think at times we forget about the relationship with the member, and that it's about the member and it's about that relationship. It's not about a specific product only. And that, I think, is one of the challenges credit unions have had with younger generations. I don't like to label them in these focused, okay, here's your generation.
Right.
But I do think that the relationship piece, because I always hear people say, well, if you focus on millennials, you're going to lose the boomers, you're going to lose the Gen X's. And
Wait, Gen X. I didn't even know that was a generation, and I'm part of it. So everybody forgets about that one.
I'm kind of like, I'm the last year of the boomer, so
okay.
65. So, but it's funny to me, because I don't know what person doesn't want to have personalized service.
Right.
And when they talk about younger generations, well, they want it personalized. Well, don't we all? So it's that relationship, and I think you see credit unions that do that, big or small. That's what makes them successful, is they don't forget about that. It's about the relationship with them.
It makes a lot of sense what you're saying there, Jimmy. I mean, there is that tie to the community as well. So it does seem like we should be able to harness that even more with the personal relationships.
Right. It's all about you, right? I think I remember that was somebody's theme back in the day, is, it's all about you and we're one of you. I think those are things that we forget sometimes, that we're in it together with our community.
Yep, absolutely. I want to move on to the leadership and life hacks portion of the show. I always have a lot of fun with this, and I think it's an opportunity for all of us to get to know you more. What motivated you originally? You have you've had a long career in credit unions, but to take the gig as president and CEO of the Maryland DC Credit Union Association, and also, like, how did you find your way to credit unions in the beginning?
Well, the way I found my way to credit unions in the beginning is I needed a job out of college. So I had went and got licensed to be a stockbroker. I thought that's what I wanted to do. I did it as an internship my last semester, realized, okay, who's really going to give me their money coming out of college of my family? I knew my dad wasn't.
Yep.
So Teachers Credit Union in Indiana had a management training program. I happened to stop by a job fair and dropped off my resume, and they said, you got a minute? Fast forward 6 weeks, I was starting in South Bend working for Vic Pantia and Rick Rice out of Teachers. So that was how I got into credit unions. and learning from them. I mean, they were young at the time. It's hard to believe that I say this now, but they were 40 years old running a $400 million credit union in 1988, which at the time was pretty large. And just the lessons I learned from them, were really important, and then had great mentors along the way as I went into credit unions. But what got me involved in the league world was when I first became CEO, I got a call from the league saying, we need you to talk to your state senator and your chief of police. They got this bill, this ATM bill, that's ridiculous. You just got to tell them to forget it. And I'm like, I don't know them. And they said, we'll just call them. And both of those gentlemen became longtime friends. And it was interesting to see that dynamic of how business and politics really interacted. I hadn't had that till then.
I was just going to ask you, that wasn't something growing up or going through school you ever even thought of, was it? Or
well, politics, I always looked at politics like, oh, wow, it's interesting to meet these politicians and do that. But then when it really is about your job and, things that you learn, oh, this is how the process, because growing up, we grew up in Northwest Indiana. My dad was a steel mill guy. So the idea of politics, really was somebody falling inside of, the blast furnace if they didn't like what they said. All of those things weren't that far-fetched. But then fast forward, getting involved in the league board and on the legislative committee, and somebody that everybody knows, one of Illinois' governors that unfortunately went to college, as they would say. When Blagojevich started sweeping the credit union's dedicated fund for millions of dollars. And I remember asking Steve Olson, who is an incredible at his craft at the league. And I said, why don't we just sue the governor? He lies to us all the time. And he said, nobody sues a sitting. We don't sue governors. So fast forward 12 more months, the bankers come and say, well, maybe it's not a far-fetched idea. Maybe we should sue them as a group. 7 years later, the coalition wins, and millions of dollars have been given back to Illinois credit unions. And it's because that's where you realized the power of the league, the credit unions collating together. And it was something that, for whatever, I just really enjoyed it. It kind of lit a fire under me because people didn't know what credit unions were. And I guess maybe it's the underdog thing in me. It's like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? So being able to explain that and communicate that, get involved, tell the story, made a big difference.
Has the inspiration changed since you've become, president and CEO of a trade association?
Yeah, I would say, whenever things go from, I don't want to say a hobby, but when it goes from being more, it's the side part of what you're doing. It's not the main focus. When you get into it as your full-time gig, right? It's like, well, why doesn't this matter to everybody? I think that's the bigger challenge is really understanding how what we do can impact credit unions and what credit unions need us to do to help them do their job easier. I think that's been the change is now it's up to us to figure out what can we do to help credit unions, whether it's regulatorily, legislatively, exposure and education training. That's such a big piece of what we do.
I respect the job you guys do, and I learned so much about what it was, from Jill, where I was like, holy smokes, you guys have a lot of bosses. This is crazy, right? Like, so you're making a lot of people happy, or trying to, right? So on a leadership side of things, how would you describe your leadership style?
I think probably it was Diana that said this, right? It's about just being you. So sports played a huge role, all the way growing up, all the way through college and that kind of thing. And you're exposed to a lot of different styles of how to do things. And I don't think there's a right or wrong way. There's just your way of doing it. And I have always been exposed to people that, and sports, I think, are a great example. You're going to lose. That's just how it is. Nobody goes undefeated forever. So I think it's the same thing in business. And I was blessed and fortunate in my entire career to be given opportunities, and I failed. But you get up, you get ready for the next play, you get ready for the next game, and you channel whatever your frustration is to do it better and to just strive for what you need to do. And for me, I try to remember that when we're working with our team is, always pull back, look at it from 20,000 feet, let people run with it, because, that's what you hire them for. You don't hire to do their job. You hire them to do their job. So I think that's really important.
You mentioned they haven't all been wins. Is there a memorable failure that you can share that or maybe one that you look back on and you're like, that was a failure at the time, but I'm glad it went that way because it turned out well in the end.
Well, yeah, there was. And it was a big one. It was when I was in the operations side of the business back at a large credit union when I was early on in my career at Teachers. And I remember we were doing a project, and you always think you're asking the right questions, right? Because I'm a big question asker. And it got to the end of the day and it wasn't right. And there were some people that were kind of sitting there just waiting for me to fail. And they had no problem letting everybody know, and my bosses know, well, see, I knew that was going to happen. And I got called into the office and I was asked, hey, what happened? And you realize I asked questions. I just asked the wrong question. I didn't ask the right question. But take responsibility for the issue. And I remember walking out of the office and somebody walks up to me and says, good answer. And I said, why is that? And they're like, well, your termination papers were over here if you would have answered it any differently. So taking responsibility for your actions, I think, is pretty important. And it all works out, I think, in the end.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. Is there something, I was looking forward to asking you this, is there something your team's heard you say so many times that they could finish your sentence?
Probably challenges. Like we were talking about something, it's like, well, what do you think? And it's always the challenge. And then the other one is, so what do you all do over at the association? And ever since I've come here, I've got these 4 things that always stick in my head. And it's, we advocate, educate, communicate, collaborate. So they just finished my sentence, put it in the PowerPoint. So that's our role for our credit unions.
Is there a mistake? You started to touch on this, about taking responsibility. But is there a mistake that maybe you made early in your career, or you work with a lot of young leaders, right? Like through the league system, that you see young leaders just make over and over again, like almost those bumps we have to take as young leaders, right? Is there a mistake that you see?
You don't want to, but you have to, right?
Right. Yeah, basically.
I think for young leaders, sometimes when you're younger, you always have these goals of, I want to be a VP, I want to be a director, I want to be X and Y. And I think those goals are great, but sometimes what you forget, and the mistake is getting that skill set and understanding. I think this was something that took a while for me to understand, is the difference between, your milestones that you need to reach versus setting a hard goal of a position. And sometimes I think we see that where, well, I've mastered these traits or these pieces of the job, but there's that maturity or experience that kind of rounds off that sometimes we just want to speed by instead of just enjoy it. And also enjoy your failures or successes, but enjoy the role you're in. I think that's a really important piece, is enjoy the role you're in and learn everything you can from it. But when you're young, it's hard because you're running hard.
Yeah, that is true. I think we're always looking ahead, right? Has there been a piece of advice or a life lesson that you received that you find yourself going back to often?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. I always think about my dad used to always tell me, I always looked up to my dad as a kid, and God rest his soul, we would always have this conversation, and he'd be just running for work, and he'd be going back and forth or doing whatever it was. And, somebody said, your dad never looks flustered. And then, of course, you're like, well, you're not home after he gets home. But my dad used to keep this on his desk, and it was, always act like a duck, cool, calm on the surface, but paddle like hell underneath. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. When you're leading an organization or doing things, nobody cares what your issues are, and they shouldn't. That's not what you're there for. So, that's the stuff that you keep below the surface. That's what you keep down, and you focus on doing what's right, and you get out there and you do it, because people feed off that, especially I think people that you lead. They're going to emulate your personality, right? Just like there's so many different ways to be a coach in things. And the other advice was be authentic. Always be who you are, because if you try to be somebody else, you're going to eventually be you. Right? Yeah. There's no way to fight it. So just be who you are and be authentic. And I think that's that's really been another motto I've always lived by.
You've mentioned some like coaches. You've mentioned your dad, and even it sounded like the early CEOs in your career. Were there some mentors that you had that really helped shape your leadership? I mean, the way that you lead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously Vic and Rick did early on, and I got another opportunity as a young person to work at United Federal Credit Union for a gentleman, Dwayne Nelson, who's now retired. But when I went to Community Trust, I was hired by a woman, Liz Davenport. She had worked at American Hospital Bed, was a CEO kind of, at the time when there weren't as many women as CEOs. And she brought me in, and she was going to be there for 3 years, and then I'd get to become CEO down the road. And after 6 months, she said, "You don't need me." She goes, "I'm done." She goes, "You're ready." And she left. And she taught me in those 6 months to a year, really, about being honest and fair with yourself and where you want to go, and letting somebody, because heck, I was in 31.
Right. Yeah.
And I, seemed like I knew everything, but I really didn't know much. And I think, the ability for her to look at things that way, that was a huge help. And then working for, at the time, when I first met Mike Valentine over at Baxter Credit Union, Mike had reached out and said, "Hey, I know what it's like to be young. Give me a call." And, eventually 10 years later, I went and worked at Baxter and worked for Mike, and just learned, I think in all of those cases, it was about letting people do their jobs, letting them fail, letting them have their success, and letting them, reap the rewards of that success. And that's rare. You don't see that all the time. I think you see it maybe some more now, but that's a trait that not all leaders have.
I think it's a tough one for a lot of people too, because, a lot of the times to get to be that leader, it's because you put your head down and got things done, and then to be like, okay, now everybody else help too. You don't have to do this alone. I think that's a tough one to learn, right? To let go a little. So
you see that with mentors. I think you see that both in business and in sports, right? You see coaches where it's all about their coaching. Well, I think the most successful coaches are the ones that it's about their team. It's about the players. And in business, it really is, we talk about, it's all about the members, which it is. But I think you got to start with your employee, right? And that's what I really learned, especially at BCU, is it's all about the employees and making sure it's very clear that they have the runway, the skills, the tools they need. And they'll do incredible things for your membership.
Something you mentioned earlier that was sticking with me was you talked about when you were with your team, like taking a look at things from 20,000 feet. If you guys run into a problem, do you have a hack like of how to take a look at it from a different angle, or, like where you're just like, we know we can do this, but we're just hitting a wall? Anything you do to kind of push through?
As a team, it's really probably just grabbing everybody together. We get together every week, but if there's something that's really kind of run up against the wall, there's not anything that anyone can't just say, "Hey, can we get together in your office or get together in the boardroom and just kind of go through this?" And I think that's really, again, asking the questions, but getting different opinions. And sometimes, right, it's harder because like you're the boss. So but I think asking people like, "Tell me what you think. Am I nuts? Am I crazy?" And sometimes they'll say yes.
You just mentioned something like the CEO can be a lonely position, right? Is that part of the reason for having, like you mentioned very early on in our conversation that like having that network outside, is that something you lean on at times as other CEOs that you have relationships with?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think you have to, right? Because it's not appropriate, I think, to talk to your team about that. But yeah, sometimes you need those people just to call up and either vent or get advice, or like, how did you deal with this? Or what did you deal with? And I've been blessed to just meet so many great people and I think this industry as a whole, everyone's giving of their time, their opinion. Most everyone I've been involved with, nobody's ever scared, or nobody's too busy to give you the time if you need help.
Yeah, one of the most beautiful things about this industry is if you ask for it, people will give it to you. So, I've had a lot of mentors in this space that have helped grow my company. So a question that I've really enjoyed asking some of your peers is like, how do you make sure that your message is staying fresh to your team, But for you, I think it's different. Also, like, do you keep the association's message fresh to the credit unions? And then there's a legislative side of it, right, too, is like, and how do you keep the credit union message to the Hill, let's just say, fresh? Is there something that you, like, do you have a trick on that or something you do there?
One of the things I try to do, Randy, is just get out and listen. Talk to our credit unions, listen to them, read what they're up to. And then on the Hill, it's the same thing. Getting out when everybody talks about 1998 and HR 1151. The only thing I really remember about all of that chaos at that time was Tom Daschle standing up saying, "You guys passed your bill with it's a Monday. You couldn't get the votes you got on your bill if you said it's Monday and you asked us to vote that it's Monday. But yet you passed a controversial bill. But the one mistake you can't not make is that now that you're in, you can't get out." Right. And you needed us and we were there for you. So now you need to be there all the time, not just when you need something, but you need to be present all the time. And I think that's been very helpful, is always being there, walking the hallways, meeting with legislators or their staff, not because we need something, but just to keep that dialogue. So you understand what they're going through. And I think as staffers change, that's another point with the message. As staffers change, you get different ages. So, I'm no longer a young professional. So once I cross that 50
we're
mark,
all growing out of that.
You're no longer young.
Right?
But I think that's the interesting part, is you just got to listen and be out there.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got a free day, nothing on the calendar, what passions do you have outside of credit unions? What does the work-life balance or integration look like for John?
It won't surprise anybody here. So it'd be getting together with friends, whether it's hopefully on the golf course or at home, hanging out on a fire pit with the family and friends, and, just hanging out. Could be going to a sporting event. I think a lot of that is you forget sometimes you need that downtime just to relax and laugh and have a good time.
A laugh is always a good thing. I want to be respectful of your time today, so I'd like to move on to the third part of the show, the rapid fire questions.
Sure.
The questions are rapid. Your answers don't have to be. All right. So do you remember the first time you got into memorable trouble? Can you beat our friend Diana's Grand Theft Auto?
No, I don't. Who can beat that?
I don't think anybody's going to be able to.
Auto. I got nothing compared to that. The only time I remember the first time I remember getting into trouble was with my parents. Is my brother and I did something. I really don't even remember what it was, but we thought it was a good idea to crawl into the fireplace, cover ourselves with the ash. So when they came looking for us, they couldn't find us. That was the idea we had. Little did we know when they walked by and we walked out of there that our footprints would show where we were.
All of it. That's what brothers are for, though. You got to make those mistakes, right? Do you have any daily routines that if you don't do, your day just feels off?
Yeah, getting up in the morning, doing prayers in the morning, and then taking a look at social media and what you posted and what some others have, just to kind of get going and having a cup of coffee with my wife. We get every morning. I think that's the one thing that I look forward to the most, is that's like our hour of just us. So if that doesn't happen, it just feels awkward. I
think that's pretty awesome, actually. That's a good way to start the day. So the random question, what's the best album of all time? That one you can listen to without skipping a song.
All right. So this one was hard because I was thinking about it, but there's actually two. So the first one would be Stevie Ray Vaughan, Live Alive. Would be number one for me, because I could listen to that and him forever. And then Frank Sinatra, Live at the Sands. Those are the two completely ends of the spectrum, but I could get by with either one.
Those are great ones to add to the year-end playlist. Will be a bunch of fun. We'll make a Spotify playlist with everybody's recommendations and stuff. Jill and I are big readers. We have a stack of books at the house. Is there a book that either you've gifted to people over time or that you just recommend that everybody should read?
Yeah, there's one book that it's from the former CEO of Baxter, actually, healthcare. He wrote a book called Values-Based Leadership.
Okay.
It's the principles of values-based leadership. And here he taught at Northwestern. He came and spoke here for us once. And, it's just pretty simple things, but that you don't think about. And I think as far as leaders go, it's the simple things that you don't realize that can make a difference. Whether it's The biggest one is there's 164 hours in a week. I think that's the right calculation. So if you say yes to something, guess what? You don't get 165 or 167. So you need to understand what your capacity is and where you're at. And that's how it starts out, and it just keeps getting better. But it's a very simple read, but it's pretty impactful.
That, quite honestly, leads me perfectly into my favorite question, which is, as you've gotten older, what's become more important to you and what's become less?
I think what's become more important to me is being present. Not always being right, but being present in the situations and listening to what people are doing. I think that's become more important to me as I've gotten older, is to sit back and listen and take the time instead of trying to rush through it all.
And what, if anything, has become less important?
Being right.
Okay.
I think that's probably the one thing, you're so worried in the beginning of your career that you got to make the right call or, have the right answer.
Yep.
Now you realize you don't have to.
To kind of go back when you were talking about the book, the idea of we only have so much time, right? Like that's one for me that protecting my time.
You got to say no, or you got to move something around.
That's right. So there's a question. I know you listen to the podcast, but people tend not to prepare for this one, even if they have, because I don't send it to you. When you hear the word success, who's the first person that pops in your head?
The first people that pop into my head are my grandparents who immigrated here from Greece with nothing. But they came and did what they had to do. Success is hard, right? Because it's whatever it is to you.
Absolutely.
So it's not about. It's always hard for me to put kind of what does it mean.
That's the reason I love that question, because we all define it differently, right? So your grandparents, did they come over? Like, was your dad? Did they born here?
Yes,
or
my
your
parents are both first generation. Both sets of my grandparents came from Greece.
Okay.
So my mom's side, my grandfather came over, then went back over, met my grandmother. 6 weeks later, they're married. She comes over young. But my dad's dad and brother, they were given $20 and a pat on the back, put on a boat and said, go make a better life for yourself. And there's somebody in this town called Chicago, so look them up. So, so that, the perseverance and the character it takes to do that is, I've always just been I wouldn't say in awe, but I've always admired that and appreciated that.
I absolutely love that answer. So, quite honestly, it's the perfect way to end. The last question that I do have for you is, do you have any final asks or final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners today?
If I had, in having our conversation, the one thing that I would say is, especially, you've asked a lot about, younger generations and what credit unions today. And I think it continues to be that what I've always learned about being authentic and being who you are, whether it's your credit union, whether it's you as a leader, whether it's you as an individual, be authentic and don't try to be something you're not. And I think that's where the success of our industry will continue to grow, is if we focus on who we are and not who we're not, is I think really important. I think that's what's going to bring us to the scale we want.
I love that. Focus on who we are, not who we're not. John, we'll link to everything that we talked about in the show today. And the show notes is at John Bratsakis on Twitter, a good way for people to get a hold of you if they have additional questions. Yeah,
I think, you've probably, you see me, we see each other on social media. So Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook.
We will link to all of them. Again, thank you, sir, so much for being on the show today. I hope you have an amazing day.
Thanks, Randy. Appreciate it. Appreciate you asking me.